Last week, at the end of this sermon, I kind of had let you guys know that these next times I preach, I'm going to be preaching these sermons that are in preparation for an evangelistic series that's happening next year. And so that's what we're doing today. These sermons are going to be doctrinal, about the doctrines of the Bible. And we're going to be exploring them in a way that makes it kind of come alive in our life. So that it's not something that, we've heard before and we're hearing it again. But rather in a perspective and in a way that actually changes our perspective on the love of God and helps us understand Him more. So that's what we're going to do today. I titled this sermon, The Forbidden Day. Does anyone have an idea of what we're talking about this morning? What are some guesses? What's up? The Sabbath. Yeah. Why would I call it the forbidden day? I mean, if any day wasn't forbidden, it would be the Sabbath, right? Well, I'll explain that like this. When I was little and I was growing up, I grew up in the Adventist church, right? And so I grew up, going to Sabbath school. My parents were Pathfinder directors. They were co-directors of the club. And so I remember having to go even when I was 5 years old. You're not a Pathfinder at 5, right? But I was there watching Aladdin in the background as they conducted the Pathfinder meetings, right? So I grew up in the Adventist church, and I grew up hearing about the Sabbath, learning on what to do and what not to do on the Sabbath. So I remember this one time, I woke up on Sunday morning, and I was so excited that it was Sunday morning, because Sundays are fun days, right? You get to wake up, you get to watch cartoons. There's some chores to do, but you get to go play with your toys again. It's really awesome. So I woke up Sunday morning, and no one else had woken up yet, and the sun was already out, which is really weird, because I am always, 100% of the time, the last person to wake up in my family. Doesn't matter what's going on, I wake up last. So I look over, and my brother's still asleep in his bed, and I go into the hallway quietly, and my mom and my stepdad are still asleep, and my baby brother is still asleep over in his room. And I'm like, what's going on? And then I thought to myself, this is awesome. Thank you, God, for keeping everyone else asleep, because now I get the TV remote. So I run downstairs, and I go and I pick that TV remote up, and I turn the TV on. And I was like, this is kind of weird, but this is so cool. And on the TV pops up one of my favorite things to watch. And I remember thinking to myself, I love watching this cartoon. But it was weird because that cartoon only ever came on Saturdays. So we had to set the recording to record it. So I was like, man, that's weird. That's really cool that they're doing replays on Sunday, but that's weird that it's playing. I remember sitting there for about 5-10 minutes as the TV's on a low volume so no one else in the house wakes up, and it just starts clicking in my head. This is a weird day. This is a weird Sunday. No one else is awake. The sun is out. The streets are quiet. The birds are chirping. And I'm watching a cartoon that only ever comes on Saturdays. So I get a little nervous, and I run back upstairs, and I look at my alarm clock, which have the dates on it, and sure enough, it is Saturday. It is not Sunday. And immediately I was like, oh my goodness. I was terrified. I was scared. I ran downstairs. I turned the TV off. I put it back where it was. There was a little dust spot where the remote was. I put it right back in the dust spot so my mom wouldn't know. I run back upstairs. I get back in bed, and I cover myself with my covers, hoping that no one else found out that I was awake. I was terrified. And then a thought crept into my head. Man, I wish we could watch TV on Sabbath. It would be so much more fun if I could watch my cartoons on Sabbath. And I remember thinking that. And growing up, there was this idea that I had of Sabbath as this forbidden day. This day in which these things that I wanted to do, I couldn't do. This day that wasn't joyful to me, but instead was burdensome. Now, don't get me wrong. I loved going to church. I loved being with my Sabbath school class and hanging out with my friends. But, coming to Sabbath, it always felt like there was things I wasn't allowed to do, like a forbidden day. And that was burdensome. Have any of you ever felt like that before? Yeah. Some shy hands going up just like this. Yeah, I felt like that. Yeah. Okay. See, we're going to be looking at the way that God establishes His Sabbath, but not just how He establishes His Sabbath. We're going to look at why it is so joyful to worship the Sabbath the way God asks us to. You see, God never wanted it to be a burdensome day, a forbidden day of a bunch of things, of lists of rules that we can't do, that we should focus on, but instead a day filled with joy, remembering that he created us, he created this world, and he can create something new in us as well. The first place we're going to look at is Genesis. Genesis chapter 2. See, there was 3 places in the Bible that I found that God institutes or reestablishes his Sabbath among his people for a number of different reasons. The first place he does it is in the creation story. In Genesis chapter 2, God has just finished creating the world. And at the beginning of Genesis chapter 2, it now talks about what he's going to do right after these 6 days of creation. Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. It says, "Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in their vast array. By the 7th day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the 7th day, he rested from all of his work. Then God blessed the day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done." There's 2 things that God does here on this Sabbath day, right? The first is that he rests on this Sabbath day, and the second is that he establishes it and makes it holy and sanctified. Now, when I was little, we used to have these little kind of dumb conversations and arguments with other people in my Sabbath school class and in my classrooms. We'd present ideas that were kind of ridiculous about God and what he could or couldn't do, right? Like one of the things we used to say is, could God create a stone he couldn't pick up, right? Well, what do you think? How many of you say, yeah, he could create a stone that he couldn't pick up? Okay. How many of you say he can't create a stone that he can't pick up? Okay. Well, yeah. And most of you kept your hands down because it's like, wait, that doesn't make sense at all. Because God can do anything, right? So he can create a stone that even he couldn't pick up. But then hold on, God can do anything, so he can pick up any stone he creates. Yeah, we'd have these kind of dumb conversations. One of the conversations we would have that actually did have a resolution to it is we'd say, hey, can God get tired? And I was like, no, God can't get tired. He's God. He's all powerful. He can't get tired. And then somebody told me, one of my classmates say, well, if he's God, he can make himself tired, can't he? I was like, wait, hold on. I guess, yeah, if he's God, he could make himself tired. Sure, all right, yeah. But he can't get tired because he's God. And we went back and forth with this. You see, when God rested here on the 7th day, he wasn't resting because he was tired of his work week. He didn't get done with the 6 days of creation and go, man, that kicked my butt. I am ready for a nap. And then went and knocked out on the 7th day. No, this rest is different than that. I'll explain it like this. When I was little, my grandpa, he bought my brother and I these model toys. He got my brother a model car, and he got me an airplane, like a little model airplane that we could build and put together. So I was building this airplane, and it took a lot of work because I hated reading directions, so I just threw them away. So it was really difficult for me to try to build this plane. So I'm trying to put it together, and the wing was on the wrong side, and then I had to correct that and fix it and do my best to put it together. But I was having so much fun putting this little toy airplane together. And after I had finished, I remember the last thing I did, I picked up the plane and I slid in, it was a fighter jet, so I slid in one of the little missiles that goes on the wings. And I remember sliding that in, and I put it down, and I leaned back, and I go, whew. I was so satisfied with the work that I had done, right? I had so much fun building it. Now, I wasn't tired from building it, right? I was excited that I was done building it because of what was going to come next, but I wasn't tired from building it. I was just satisfied. So I sat there and I admired it for a little bit, and then I picked it up and I put it on my dresser where I wanted it to sit, and I looked up at it and I just sat there and looked at it for a second. How long do you think that lasted? I was like 8 years old. So just looking at it wasn't good enough. I took it down and I was like, I can't just look at this thing. I have to play with it. So I picked it up and I started going around my room, and I was like, pew, pew. And then I'd go and pull my little Hot Wheels out, and I'd fire one of the missiles and go and blow up a car. as young boys do, and I fly this little plane all over the place, and I had so much fun enjoying the plane. I was done working on it. Now it was time for me to enjoy it, to rest from the work I had done, and to be satisfied with the work that was completed. You see, what God is doing here is he's not kicking back in a lawn chair and going, oh, that was tired. I need a lemonade and a nap. No, he was satisfied with the work he had done. It says just before this that he looked and he said, it is very good. And then it says that he was done, and thus the heavens and the earth were completed in their vast array. He's painting this beautiful picture of a beautiful work that he was done creating. And now he was resting, satisfied with the work that he had done. And the second thing he does after he was done resting was he sanctified this day and he made it holy so that you and I could also rest on that day, so that we can follow in his example. And instead of coming to the Sabbath and being like, I believe in Sabbath naps. I am a firm believer of Sabbath naps. But God has a special kind of rest in store for us on the Sabbath. A rest that is filled with joy, being able to come to his creation, look at his created work and going, whew, wow, that is awesome, God. Being able to spend time in his creation, in his nature, with the animals, with the birds and the trees, and even with other people, because believe it or not, he created other people too. We're able to spend time with that and just be blessed with the joy that it brings. In the same way that he was, he rested and sanctified it, made it different than any other day, because he knew that if we rested like him, our lives would be satisfied and filled with joy. This is the first time that God establishes the Sabbath. He didn't give any rules. He didn't say, this is what you're supposed to do. This is what you're not supposed to do. Instead, he came to the end of his week and he said, wow, I want to enjoy that. And that's exactly what he has in store for us. A day filled with joy and fulfillment. The next time that he kind of establishes his Sabbath, or rather reestablishes it, because he already did that in creation among his people, is in Exodus chapter 20. Now, what's different about this time is that now sin has entered the world, right? So now that sin is in the world, he goes about it a little bit differently. He approaches the situation a little bit differently. Because the context of what's happening here in Exodus 20 is that God's people, his nation, his Israelites, have been in captivity for 400 years. Hundreds of years they had been trapped in captivity. They'd been slaves under another nation. And not just any nation, this was the Egyptian nation. I mean, they've got gods for everything. They had a god for frogs. They had a god for rivers. They had a god for the sun and the moon, and they even had a god that sits in between the sun and the moon when they're rotating. They had a god for that. I mean, that's crazy. They had so many gods. So you can imagine the perspective that the Israelites have when they come to God's Sabbath, having been forced to do labor on his Sabbath for hundreds of years, having been forced to look at and admire other gods instead of their own. You can imagine the perspective they might have of God. They know him, they know about his Sabbath, but clearly something has gone wrong. Sin has guided their minds away from the way it was supposed to be kept, away from the way that brought them joy and fulfillment. So he gives these commands in order to help them with it. This is what he says, Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter or your male or female servant, not even your animals or any foreigner that's residing in your towns, not even the strangers around us. Nobody should do work. This is what he's saying. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath and made it holy. Here in his command, he's pointing back to the very first Sabbath when he established it. Now, I want to tell you this story because the reason he's giving these commands, don't work, don't let your animals work, don't let anyone else work, don't even let the strangers around you work, don't even cause them to work. The reason he's giving these rules is really to help the Israelites better understand and be fulfilled in the Sabbath. It's like this. When I was little, my mom gave my brother and I aluminum bats so that we could play baseball, right? Crazy idea. We were boys, but she gave us aluminum bats. And when we got those bats, there were some rules on how we were allowed to use those bats, right? The first rule, actually it was the first rule anytime she gave us anything. It was don't hit your brother with it, right? Yeah, it was literally anything she gave us, don't hit your brother with it. Could be a little action figure, a stick, could even be a leaf. Doesn't matter. Don't hit your brother with it. That was just a bottom line rule. And then she gave a list of other rules on how to use it. And one of the rules that she gave was, you're only allowed to use it in the way that it's supposed to be used. You're supposed to use it for baseball. So only use it when you're playing baseball. And I didn't really understand that because there are so many uses for a bat. And then after this story, I tell you, I understood. So my brother and I, we go out into the backyard. And we're playing. We're just having fun one day, right? And we end up playing this new game. We're inventing this new game. It's like basketball, baseball, golf, right? Yeah, it's crazy. We got a basketball and our baseball bats, and we just started passing the ball back and forth to each other with the baseball bats. Don't know why we chose to do it, but we never played the game again after this. The two of us, we'd swing the bat and we'd hit the ball and it would just roll to the other person, right? And then eventually, as we were playing, we wanted to get a little fancy with it, right? So we figured that if we hit the ball at an angle, we could make it bounce over to the other person. So we started hitting it at an angle and making it bounce. The only problem is this is an aluminum bat, okay? It's a metal bat, right? We'll just call it what it is. And a very bouncy basketball. So every time we hit the ball, the bat kind of bounced back just a little bit, right? Just a little bit. So one time, my brother, he takes the bat and he swings it over his head and hits the ball like this. Boom. And what do you think happens? It comes right back into his face with double the force it went into the ball with and hits him, boom, right in the nose. Just cracks his nose. And I sit there and I'm like, are you okay? And then I see blood just pouring down his face. And then he goes, and I just die laughing. Like there wasn't a funnier moment I can think of. Actually, there was one funnier time I can think of, but top two was him hitting himself in the face with a bat. And he just goes, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. And I'm like, I don't know what to do either. And I'm just rolling on the floor laughing as he's bleeding from his face after hitting himself in the face with a bat. And my mom comes running out, and she takes him inside, and she fixes him up and helps his nose stop bleeding. And after that, we understood why we're only supposed to use him for baseball, so we don't hurt ourselves like that. See, the reason my mom gave us these rules, it wasn't so that she could control us or make us have less fun with the bats, but it was so that we could enjoy them the way they were supposed to be enjoyed. Same things happen in here. The reason that God is now instructing his Israelites, hey, don't work on the Sabbath. And there's more laws that come after this that kind of touch around what he meant when he said that. In Nehemiah chapter 10, verse 31, it says this: when the neighboring peoples bring merchandise or grain to sell on the Sabbath, we will not buy from them on the Sabbath or on any holy day. So they're saying we're not going to buy things or sell things on the Sabbath either. And then later in Isaiah, he goes, and we'll read it here in a second, he talks about not even doing our own pleasures on the Sabbath, even going as far as to say not even talking the way we usually talk on the Sabbath. These aren't rules that he's sitting there and saying, you're forbidden to do all of these things. But rather, his people have no idea how to enjoy his Sabbath. They come to the Sabbath, and it's not a day of joy for them. It's not a day of rest, the way that God had intended it to be. It's not a day where they come to the Sabbath and they go, oh, God, I am ready to enjoy your creation. But instead they come to the Sabbath and they're like, oh, I got one more homework assignment to finish. I got one more thing to think about. I did most of my work, but I got to remember that Sunday morning, 6 a.m., I've got to get up and make this transaction, buy this thing, sell this thing. And it's just a burden. It's a burden to them. So God tells them, stop working and don't cause anyone else to work around you. Stop buying and selling stuff. Stop doing your own thing so that instead you can enjoy my creation. So that instead you can take rest. You can go and look at the trees and spend time in the nature and spend time with other people to remember that I created the world. And when we take time on the Sabbath to remember that God created this magnificent world, we can remember also that the same power he creates the world with is the same power he recreates me with. That same power that makes those beautiful trees sprout out is the same power that makes me righteous. And now instead of working and selling and going out to eat and watching cartoons and playing with all of these things that I would normally do on all of these other days, instead I can take a second and go, God, I praise your name. I have joy today because I'm looking at your creation. In Isaiah chapter 58, this is what he says, kind of explains it like this. I think it's a good way to explain it. He says in Isaiah 58, verses 13 and 14, if you keep your feet from breaking the Sabbath and from doing as you please on my holy day, if you call the Sabbath a delight and the Lord's holy day honorable, and if you honor it by not going your own way or doing as you please, or even speaking idle words, then guess what? This is what he says will happen. Then you will find your joy in the Lord. I will cause you to ride in triumph and on the heights of the land, and to feast on the inheritance of your father Jacob. When we worship God on the Sabbath, not the way the world tells us to, not this list of forbidden things that I can't do, but instead the way that God did when he created the world and established his Sabbath. When we worship that way, God says we'll find our joy in the Lord. This isn't a forbidden day. This isn't a day that I can't do all of these other things. This is a day that I get to spend time remembering that God created this beautiful, amazing world, and he creates righteousness in me as well. If I just look at this day as a day of forbidden things, oh man, it's a huge burden. I'll show you. We're going to go to Mark chapter 2. You see, when I was growing up and even all the way through college, this is kind of the perspective that I would have of the Sabbath. And I would bounce back and forth and struggle with it. I'd be like, God, I'm supposed to enjoy your Sabbath, but man, I want to get on my social media and I want to get on YouTube and I want to watch these things and this is kind of difficult. This is hard for me. And when I was in college, I had one friend use this verse actually that we're about to read to kind of justify not worshiping God on the Sabbath. He was like, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So I should be able to do anything I want on the Sabbath. That's how I'm going to find my joy. But God had a different way of us understanding the Sabbath. He knew what we needed, and this is how he describes it. Mark chapter 2, Jesus and his disciples have just spent the day doing ministry, really. It's Sabbath, and they're doing ministry. They're spending time in God's creation and among God's creation, which includes other people, and they're leading people to Christ and letting them know, hey, when God established this Sabbath, he made it so that we can remember that he created the world, and the same God who created the world can make you righteous as well. They're going around sharing this message. And then Mark chapter 2, verse 23, this is what we read. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples walked along. As his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to them, look, why are they doing what is unlawful to do on the Sabbath? Now we're going to pause there. See, when we start to think of the Sabbath as a forbidden day, a list of things we can't do, there's generally two things that we end up doing instead. One, we create so many rules for ourselves that it becomes completely unbearable. And two, we start to justify doing other things on the Sabbath instead of honoring and worshiping God. See, the the Pharisees, they had discovered that God didn't want them working on the Sabbath. So they were like, we're going to break down and describe everything that counts as work to make sure that we don't do it. And they got a lot of crazy rules. I'll share with you a few. One of the rules was they weren't allowed to walk more than 500 steps away from their house on the Sabbath, which is crazy because I walk 500 steps in the shower. So that would be it for me, right? So you're not allowed to walk more than 500 steps. But right along the book of rules is the book of loopholes, right? We all know that. And so they were allowed to walk the 500 steps. And let's say the temple was 600 steps away, okay? They'd walk the 500 steps. And then they'd sit down, pull out a sandwich, eat a sandwich. And the law said, well, wherever you eat, that is where your home is. And so they were like, okay, this is now my new home. Stick half the sandwich back in, walk another 500 steps over to the temple, worship God, walk 500 back, sit down again, eat the rest of the sandwich, and go back home. Boom, I didn't break the Sabbath. Okay, no, but you just created more work for yourself. What in the world? I could have just made it in half the time because you stopped to eat a sandwich. They had more rules, crazy ones. One like this. You weren't allowed to spit in the dirt on the Sabbath. What? Why not? Now, my mom just told me I wasn't allowed to spit in general. I didn't work all the time. I did it anyways. But she was like, if you're going to do it, at least do it on the asphalt. But you weren't allowed to spit on the dirt on the Sabbath, right? And this is why. Because if you spit into the dirt, then guess what? The moisture from your saliva is creating mud. And what is mud used for? Bricks and mortar and houses. So you are doing work on the Sabbath if you are spitting in the dirt. What? That is crazy. But right along the book of laws is the book of loopholes, right? So let's say I swallowed a bug on the Sabbath and I just really had to hack it up, okay? What am I supposed to do? Like, I can't just do it in the dirt. I got to find another way. So I'm allowed to do this. If I pick up a rock and just spit out onto this rock and then set the rock face up so that the spit is on the top of the rock for everyone to see and it doesn't touch the dirt, I haven't worked on the Sabbath because I haven't created mud. So I'm good. Okay, I guess not, but you just did a whole bunch of other steps that was way more burdensome. I mean, do you see how crazy this can get when we look at the Sabbath day as a list of different rules of things we're not allowed to do and we are supposed to do? It just gets so burdensome. And so this is what the Pharisee is saying when he turns to Jesus and goes, hey, your disciples are breaking the Sabbath because they're taking the grain from the head of the wheat and they're crushing it. And they're doing a sort of thrashing motion. And that's work, so they're not allowed to do it. They're breaking the Sabbath. And so this is how Jesus responds. He's trying to teach the Pharisees the true nature of the Sabbath as established in creation. You see, God doesn't change. We know that. I can give you tons of verses that talk about how God doesn't change. He's the same yesterday as he is today, and he will be tomorrow. He didn't change his Sabbath here. He's clarifying it for the Pharisees that had taken the laws that he had given to protect them and had made them burdensome. And he wanted to free them from that burden. So this is how he responds. Verse 25, he answered, Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar, the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for the priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. You see, the story that Jesus is referring to is in 1 Samuel. David is running from Saul because Saul's trying to kill him. David's the new anointed king, and Saul didn't want to give up his power. And so David is running away from Saul. And as he's running from Saul, he gets to this town called Nob, right? And as he gets there, he's hungry, famished, and so are the rest of the people with him, right? And so he comes to the high priest, and he asks the high priest, "Hey, do you have anything to eat?" And Abiathar, the high priest, doesn't have just anything to eat because he's a priest. The only thing that the priests would eat were the showbread that was holy and only lawful for the priests to be able to eat, and the sacrifices, the leftovers of the sacrifices. That was the only thing they had to eat. So the priest went into the temple, and seeing that this was God's anointed king and that he was hungry and that he needed food, he went into the temple and he grabbed the holy showbread and he gave it to David for him and his companions to eat. How come David was allowed to do that when the law said that nobody can do it except for the priest? Well, Jesus is about to explain it right here. Verse 27, then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath. You see, what happens when we start to think of the Sabbath day as this day of forbidden things is it clouds our mind. Not only does it take away our ability to see God as our creator, as the person who is God, even of the Sabbath, but it also robs our ability to be able to experience joy the way that God designed it to be experienced on the Sabbath. It robs those things from us. The Sabbath day is not a list of things that are forbidden for us to do and list of things that we must complete. It's a day that God designed for us to have satisfaction and joy in. Looking at the completed work that he has made in creation and saying, the same work he completed that I see right now, he's going to complete in my own life and make me righteous. That's the Sabbath. That's the joy he wants us to experience. But when we look at it as a list of forbidden things, or even look at it as a day that I can do just anything, what it does is it robs that joy. Because now the Pharisee couldn't even look at God in the face and recognize that he was Lord even of the Sabbath. He couldn't do it. And if that Pharisee was to say, I'm able to do anything because the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, then he'd be committing the exact same sin, robbing himself of the joy that God is trying to give him. You see, the way that God designed the Sabbath in creation was that it was a day of restful rejoicing. I'm going to read for you Isaiah again. Isaiah chapter 58, verses 13 and 14. If you keep your feet from breaking the Sabbath, from doing as you please on my holy day, if you call the Sabbath a delight and the Lord's holy day honorable, and if you honor it by not going your own way and not doing as you please or speaking idle words. He's saying, guys, if you would follow my example in creation, when God finished creating the world, he was done with the work. He was done with it. There was nothing more for him to do. And then he took a step back. He was satisfied in it, just like I looked at my little model airplane. But that wasn't enough. God enjoyed his creation, spending time with Adam and the rest of the things that he created. This is what God did on the Sabbath. He was in his creation, enjoying it, enjoying the people, enjoying the trees, enjoying the nature. And he gave it to us as a sanctified and holy day so that we can enjoy it too. And this is what he says, if you do that, if you follow my example, verse 14, then you will find your joy in the Lord. The Sabbath day is the most joyful day that I can find in the week. Not because I make sure that I don't do this and I do that. It's the most joyful day because it's the only day in the week that God set aside for me to be able to look at his creation and remember that since he created that, he can create righteousness in me. Let's pray. Dear Lord, thank you so much for your Sabbath. I pray, Lord, that we might be able to honor it the way you ask us to, that we might be able to find joy in it the way you tell us to, Lord. Help us to follow your example and to do as you did on the Sabbath, resting in satisfaction and joy in the work that you have completed, not only in this world, but also in us. In Jesus' name I pray, amen.